Lecture 22, Petronius and Apuleius.
Hello and welcome back to Lecture 22. In this lecture we're going to talk about the development of the ancient novel. We'll focus in particular on the two Roman novels that survive, the fragmentary Satyricon by Petronius and the Metamorphoses or Golden Ass by Apuleius. But I want to begin with a description of the ancient Greek novel to give you some necessary background for our discussion of those two Roman works. Now, the novel is often seen as the quintessential representation of modern literature, but in fact it had its genesis in Greece, probably in the 1st century AD or perhaps even earlier. There's one partial novel that was discovered in 1893 that may date as far back as 100 BC, back into the Hellenistic age. We have 5 complete surviving Greek novels. The best known of these is probably Daphnis and Chloe by Longus. And these surviving Greek novels are all variations on a standard plot, one which features the trials and tribulations of a pair of young lovers. Typically, the Greek novel portrays an innocent pair of well-born teenagers just coming into adulthood who fall in love with one another, and they are either prevented from marrying or they are separated right after their marriage by a series of misadventures and misfortunes. They journey to exotic lands, for instance, Egypt, Ethiopia, Italy, that sort of place. Standard elements that they encounter include storms, shipwrecks, abduction by pirates, attempted rape or seduction of the girl who remains steadfastly chaste, and even sometimes apparent death or one of the other of the lovers. Finally, there's a happy ending in a reunion of the loving young pair. They either are rejoined in their marriage or they are allowed to marry at the end. Now, we can see several sources of influence on this typical plot of the Greek novel, including most obviously New Comedy. New Comedy's influence is evident in the boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back again plotline of the Greek novel, and also in the use of extravagant coincidences to further the storyline. But interestingly enough, we can also see the influence of epic and of history on the Greek novel. The adventures, shipwrecks, kidnappings, and so forth, all of them seem pretty clearly to recall the adventures of Odysseus in books 9 through 12 of the Odyssey, and the detailed descriptions of exotic lands where the young couple travel seem to owe a great deal to the ethnographic portions of Herodotus, to the sections of the histories in which Herodotus talks about various different cultures and places. The novel's use of prose, novels are by definition written in prose, seems unsurprising to modern readers. We assume that that's how fiction is written. We don't expect fiction to be in poetry. But in fact, this was a surprising departure in the ancient world from the expectations of what was appropriate for prose and what was appropriate for poetry. Prose had been the métier of historians, orators, and philosophers. Fiction had previously been written in poetic form, at least this kind of fantastic adventure story fiction, romantic fiction, that was considered appropriate for poetry. Remember, comedy is a poetic genre, and so the use of prose in the novel was a departure from previous conventions of ancient literature. Now, the Greek novel had a standard form and plot, as I've just outlined, but our surviving Roman novels show a freedom of invention and imagination that is both bewildering and exhilarating. We have only 2 extant Roman novels, and one of those is frustratingly fragmentary. That's the Satyricon of Petronius, who probably died around AD 66, if he's the Petronius we think he is. I'll come back to that in a few moments. The second novel, which fortunately is complete, the second Roman novel, is the Metamorphoses of Apuleius, who was born around 125 AD and died around 170. This work is more commonly known as the Golden Ass. St. Augustine, whom we'll meet in Lecture 24, tells us that Apuleius' work was often called the Golden Ass, and I will tend to refer to it that way in this lecture just to avoid the possibility of confusion with Ovid's Metamorphoses. Now, these 2 works, Satyricon and the Golden Ass, seem to depend, at least in part, on the conventions of the Greek novel for their form and for their subject matter. Both are written in prose to begin with, although Satyricon incorporates segments of poetry as well. Both include stories of romantic, or at least erotic, escapades, adventures, and misadventures. But the characters in the Greek novels that we have are rather colorless and stereotypical. You could interchange them from one novel to another. The young girl, the young boy, neither one of them has much individual character in the Greek novels. In contrast to that, these Roman novels feature extremely individualistic and highly memorable personages. So to talk about the Satyricon first, who was the author is the first question that we have with this work, and the answer to that is that the author of Satyricon was perhaps, some scholars would say probably, the same Petronius who was a prominent figure in the circle of the Emperor Nero. Nero reigned from AD 54 to 68. And in the Annals, Tacitus, the same Tacitus we discussed in the previous lecture, describes a man named Petronius as Nero's arbiter elegantiae, his judge of taste or judge of elegance. This seems to mean that Nero relied on this Petronius to tell him what was and was not truly elegant, truly tasteful. So Petronius was Nero's advisor in matters of taste and elegance. Tacitus further says that Petronius tended to reverse night and day. He stayed up all night, slept all day, he held lavish parties, and so forth. And Tacitus tells us, finally, that Petronius was accused of treason by a jealous rival and was allowed to commit suicide, or ordered to commit suicide by Nero, rather than to face execution. And Petronius supposedly made even his own death an occasion to display his urbanity and wit. He invited friends in, joked with them, opened his veins and bled a bit, then had his veins bound up so that he could eat and drink a bit more, and continued to joke and to chat with his friends, and then committed suicide a little bit more, and then continued the party. So supposedly Petronius was an extremely urbane, witty, elegant man who advised Nero in matters of taste. Is this Petronius the same man who wrote the Satyricon? We would like to think so, just because we would like to know who the author is. Knowing who the author is, when he lived, and the circumstances of his own life tells us so very much about a work, as we've seen throughout these parts of this course. But we cannot be sure that the Petronius, whose name has come down to us as the author of Satyricon, is the same Petronius whom Tacitus refers to as Nero's judge of taste. The manuscripts of Satyricon do in fact say that it is by Petronius, but there's no unambiguous internal evidence to indicate that it's the same Petronius. The novel does not directly refer or indirectly refer to Petronius's role in Nero's court, and there's nothing else that would clinch the identification, nothing to make it absolutely clear that we're talking about the same man. And Tacitus does not say that Petronius wrote anything. He doesn't tell us that Petronius wrote a novel, or for that matter, anything else. And it is at least a bit troubling that Satyricon, as we'll see in a few minutes, deals mainly with lower class characters and seems to indicate someone, an author who knows a great deal about lower class characters, their style of speech, their style of life. Would Petronius of Nero's court have this knowledge of or this interest in lower class characters? It seems to remain an open question whether Petronius of Nero's court and Petronius, the author of the Satyricon, are the same man. And this is frustrating for many reasons, not least because it makes a firm dating of the novel impossible. Without knowing the author, we aren't sure exactly when this work was written. If Petronius is the Petronius of Nero's court, then it's possible that Satyricon is actually earlier than our earliest fully surviving Greek novel, and that raises the question of, did the Greek novels that we have draw on Satyricon to a certain extent, rather than the other way around? Chronology is important for knowing direction of influence, but we have to leave the question of the authorship of Satyricon there. We simply don't know. Whoever its author, Satyricon is a difficult work to categorize, not least because of its fragmentary state. Some scholars question whether we should properly call Satyricon a novel at all, in fact. We don't know what else to call it, but novel isn't necessarily quite the right term for it. The original work was perhaps in as many as 20 books. Portions of only 3 of those survive. Probably those portions come from relatively late in the narrative, and much of what remains is short, disjointed passages rather than long narrative sequences. The longest narrative, Trimalchio's Dinner, which describes the extremely ostentatious and vulgarly bad taste dinner of a freedman, Trimalchio, someone who was born a slave, gained his freedom, and became enormously rich. This longest narrative, Trimalchio's Dinner Party, probably made up the bulk of one book of Satyricon. But with the other passages that survive, we can't even be certain of the order in which the remaining fragments would have appeared in the original text. We don't even know which narrative bit comes before which other narrative bit. Furthermore, the narrative includes large sections of poetry, and it is unlike other ancient novels in that regard. Petronius here, I'm calling the author Petronius, seems to be drawing on a genre called Menippean satire. That was a genre that blended prose and verse. But the basic framework of Satyricon, as we can reconstruct it from the fragments, features the adventures of a main character or narrator, and Satyricon was and is so lengthy a work that novel seems as accurate a term as any other to categorize Satyricon. Despite the disjointed nature of the remains of this work, we can still get some sense of its overall nature. The book features, as I just said, a narrator. He's named Encolpius, and it also features his friends and sidekicks, including his young male lover, Gaiton. The portions that have survived focus on different characters with whom Encolpius interacts during a series of adventures set in South Italy. And the overall tone is decidedly irreverent, bawdy, downright raucous. Many of the adventures in the portions of the work that have survived include attempted and often very successful seductions of Gaiton, of the narrator's young lover Gaiton. Now, this is one reason that we tend to suppose the Satyricon directly and intentionally parodies Greek novels. Gaiton's willingness to be seduced and his lack of fidelity to Encolpius, and for that matter his gender as a male rather than a female, can be seen as mirror images, as satirical opposites of the heroine of a standard Greek novel such as Chloe and Daphnis and Chloe. Remember, as I said, the plot of a Greek novel often includes attempted rapes or seductions of the heroine. She remains steadfastly chaste and is returned to her lover or her husband as loyal as she was the day she left him. Gaiton, on the other hand, is only too willing to be seduced by anyone and everyone other than Encolpius, and so this can be seen as a spoof, as a reversal of the standard of the Greek novel. Our reading of this plot element as parody of a Greek novel is strengthened by the fact that there are other clearly parodic elements in Satyricon. For instance, Trimalchio's Dinner Party, that extremely ostentatious, over-the-top, vulgar dinner given by a nouveau riche freedman, pretty clearly parodies or satirizes Plato's Symposium, a dialogue in which Plato has characters including Socrates, Aristophanes, Alcibiades, and others meet and discuss the nature of love at a drinking party, a symposium. So we have a parody of Plato in Trimalchio's Dinner, and we have a parody of the Odyssey as well. Encolpius suffers from the wrath of Priapus, the Roman god of male potency, just as Odysseus suffers from the wrath of Poseidon in the Odyssey. So given that we can say with a good deal of confidence that the Satyricon deliberately parodies philosophy and epic, it also seems to be something we can say with a good deal of confidence that the relationship between Encolpius and Gaiton is meant as a parody of the young lovers plot of an ancient novel. Now, when we turn to Apuleius and his work Metamorphoses, or The Golden Ass, we are on firmer ground for several reasons. The work is complete, first and foremost, and we know a good deal more about the author. We know who he was, and we have some other works by this same author. Apuleius was born around AD 125 in Medoris in North Africa. His parents were well off. He was educated in Carthage, Athens, and Rome. And as a young man, he married a wealthy older widow named Pudentilla. In either 158 or 159, he was made the defendant in a lawsuit brought by Pudentilus' relatives who thought that she must have been enchanted in order to marry him. They charged him in court, they charged Apuleius with using magic to induce this wealthy older widow to marry him. And Apuleius' apology, or his speech in his own defense at this trial, has survived, as has a collection of his public speeches called the Florida, which means flowery speeches, basically, from the 160s. We can't securely date The Golden Ass, Apuleius' novel. Most scholars think it's a work from fairly late in the author's life. We don't know the exact date of it. Now, the plot of The Golden Ass centers around the adventures of Lucius, a young man, the narrator of the work, who, through a terrible mistake with something he thinks is a love potion, is transformed into a donkey. That's the ass of the alternative title. And golden doesn't mean that the donkey is gold. It's a reference to the beautiful linguistic style, the beautiful narrative style of the novel. So the ass of Apuleius, which is golden in its presentation. Lucius learns that to become unenchanted and transformed back into his rightful shape as a man, he must eat some roses. It's very simple. The antidote to this magic potion, which turns one into a donkey, is to eat some roses and then one's turned back into a man. However, a series of misadventures prevents Lucius from getting any roses. Every time he approaches a rose bush, something happens to drive him away. His wanderings, tribulations, kidnappings, and erotic adventures, yes, erotic adventures with human women, despite the fact that he is in the form of a donkey, provide a hilarious spoof of the adventures of a young lover in a serious novel. Finally, in the last book of the novel, Lucius throws himself upon the mercy of the goddess Isis, the great Egyptian goddess, and she transforms him back into his proper state. Now, The Golden Ass is an extraordinarily rich, complex, and multifaceted work. It would take several lectures to do it justice. Its sources include not only Greek novels, but also an earlier Greek short story about a man transformed into a donkey, and a genre usually known as Milesian tales. So Apuleius is drawing on various different threads to put them together into this work. The narrator himself says in the introductory paragraphs of The Golden Ass that he's adapting a story from the original Greek. This was probably a story by a man named Lucius of Patrae. That's where probably Apuleius got his narrator's name. That story, unfortunately, is lost. We have an abridged version of it called Lucius or the Donkey, which is attributed to another Greek author, Lucian. I know all these Luciuses and Lucians are confusing, but the story about a donkey, about a transformation into a donkey by Lucius of Patrae, is lost. We have an abridged version attributed to the Greek author Lucian. The exact relationship between Lucian or the original story he's abridging and Apuleius' novel remains a matter of controversy, but at least it seems clear that the Greek original was considerably shorter than Apuleius' version. It may have provided the basic idea for the plot, a man transformed into a donkey and his subsequent adventures, but the transformation of that story into a full-length novel is Apuleius' own. The Golden Ass incorporates a great many tales within a tale, a great many subsidiary stories, and in the opening paragraphs, in the very first sentence, in fact, Apuleius tells us, or the narrator Lucius tells us, that he's putting together different stories in a Milesian manner. Now here Apuleius is drawing on a genre called Milesian tales, which were short, bawdy, erotic stories, and there are a great many such inset stories throughout the Golden Ass, spoken in the voice of several different characters having to do with sexual adventures and misadventures. But the longest and most important inset tale, which takes up books 4 through 6 of the novel, is the story of Cupid and Psyche. This story is far more complex and far more serious than the standard bawdy Milesian tale. Lucius, still in the form of a donkey, overhears the story of Cupid and Psyche when he's in the hands of bandits who have kidnapped a young girl. He's their donkey. He's carrying their burdens. The bandits have kidnapped a young girl. And an old woman tells this girl the story of Psyche to take the girl's mind off of her own troubles. This story, the story of Cupid and Psyche, clearly follows the plot of a Greek novel. It's the story of the god Cupid, the equivalent of Eros in Greek, the god of desire and sexual attraction, and his marriage to and separation from a girl named Psyche. The main story, as Apuleius tells it, revolves around Psyche's wanderings, the tasks she faces, the difficulties she encounters, partly through the hatred of her mother-in-law, the goddess Venus, and finally the reconciliation and reunion of Cupid and Psyche, and her transformation into a goddess so that they can live together quite literally, happily, forever after. Cupid is a god, Psyche becomes a goddess at the end of the work. So the story clearly follows the plot of a Greek novel. Young couple separated shortly after their marriage, trials and tribulations, happy reunion. But it's also, no less clearly, an allegory of the progress of the soul. Remember in the lecture on the Iliad, I mentioned that the Greek word for soul, for what goes to the underworld, is psyche, psyche in English. It's exactly the same word used in this story of Cupid and Psyche. One could equally well say that this is the story of desire and the soul. Those are what those two words, Cupid and Psyche, mean. In fact, it is an open question whether there was any pre-existing myth of Cupid and Psyche, or whether Apuleius simply made this story up for the purposes of his own work, his own novel. Clearly, even if he is drawing on a pre-existent traditional myth, Apuleius reworks the story to make it a very obvious, carefully crafted literary allegory of the progress of the soul towards eventual immortality. In this one episode, the interspersed Milesian tales in The Golden Ass, the serious Greek novel which Apuleius is spoofing throughout, the use of myth or perhaps invented myth as self-conscious allegory, and the plotline of Apuleius's own novel all intersect. This is what I mean by saying this is an extraordinarily complex and fascinating work. Now, the Cupid and Psyche episode is consciously allegorized mythology, but it's far from the only part of the narrative to deal with gods or the divine. The Golden Ass is, among other things, a precious source of information for scholars on religious belief systems and the religious world and worldview of Romans in the 2nd century AD, or at least of Romans living in Africa in the 2nd century AD. Lucius's retransformation from an ass or a donkey back into a man is affected by the direct intervention of the goddess Isis at the end of the novel. Book 11 begins with Lucius' prayer to Isis for help and her answering epiphany. She appears to him. He has a vision of her, and she tells him, among other things, that the very next day there will be a procession in her honor, and that a priest in this procession will be carrying a garland of roses, that Lucius, in his donkey form, should make his way up to this priest, eat the roses, and he'll be transformed back into human form. This does indeed happen, and Lucius is initiated into the cult of Isis as a priest in gratitude for the goddess's epiphany and for her helping him. Probably Apuleius himself was an initiate into the cult of Isis because he seems to know a very, very great deal about it. And in fact, the description of Lucius's initiation is the fullest surviving account of Isis worship that we have from the ancient world. It doesn't tell us nearly everything we would like to know about the worship of Isis because, like many ancient religious cults, the worship of Isis was a mystery religion. That means that the ceremonies held in honor of the goddess, the rites that were performed in her honor, were open only to initiates, and the initiates were bound by an oath not to talk about what happened in their ceremonies, what they did to honor Isis, to any non-initiates. And so Lucius, the narrator, or Apuleius, the author, when they're describing Lucius' initiation into the cult of Isis, tells us as much as is proper to tell, but stops short of describing the things that only initiates can know. So it by no means gives us a full description of Isis worship, but it is the fullest description that we have. It tells us more than any other work we have. Now, along with giving us a glimpse into Isis worship, one variety of belief among the Romans of Apuleius' day, the Golden Ass also fascinatingly indicates the scorn with which some Romans viewed Christianity. There are a couple of places where Apuleius addresses Christianity directly. One is in his description, the clearest one, his description of a cruel baker's wife that occurs in Book 9. He writes, and I'm quoting Walsh's translation, "There was not a single vice which that most despicable woman did not possess. Every conceivable wickedness had accumulated in her mind as in some filthy cesspool. She was crabbed and crotchety, libidinous and bibulous, obdurate and obstinate. Her greed was evident in her base thieving, her prodigality, and her unsightly extravagance. She was a foe to fidelity and made war on chastity. In addition, she despised and ground beneath her heel the powers of heaven. Instead of adhering to a sure faith, she sacrilegiously feigned bold awareness of a deity whom she proclaimed to be the only God. By devising empty ceremonies, she misled the people at large and deceived her hapless husband by devoting herself to early morning drinking and day-long debauchery." A pretty vivid portrait of an utterly debauched and immoral woman, and her worship of one true God is portrayed as part of her immorality or amorality. This description must refer either to Christianity or to Judaism. Those are really the only candidates. And given the ascendancy of Christianity in northern Africa in Apuleius' day, it's pretty clear, I think, that what he's talking about here is the Christian God. In fact, P.G. Walsh, the scholar who did the translation I just read to you, has suggested that the Golden Ass's description of the religion of Isis was meant in part as he puts it, a, quote, counterblast to the meteoric spread of Christianity in Africa in the later 2nd century, close quote. So religion is one area in which the Golden Ass is useful to social historians, but it's far from the only area. The Golden Ass and Satyricon both preserve a great deal of information about social interactions, everyday life, and the overall feel of Roman society in these centuries. Now, we have to be careful, of course, to allow for caricature and exaggeration on the part of these authors. Humorous novels should not be, cannot be, must not be read as direct reporting. But with that caveat in mind, we can mine these texts for a great deal of information about social and cultural realities of lower class and nouveau riche Romans. Apuleius' descriptions of street scenes, the characters with whom Lucius interacts, the speech patterns of the characters at Trimalchio's dinner party, all of those things are very, very useful to the social historian. Allowing for caricature and exaggeration, they are useful representations of what Roman life was actually like. And these texts are also invaluable in their use of the Latin language. The Golden Ass is written in an inimitable style. As I mentioned already, that's where the golden comes from. It incorporates rhyme, alliteration, rhythmic patterns that are a reader's delight and a translator's nightmare. Just to give you one very brief example, in the description of the baker's wife that I read to you a couple of minutes ago, there's this list of adjectives with no ands, no connectives between them. She's described as saiwa, skaiwa, wiriosa, ebriosa, pervicox, pertinax. What are you going to do with that in translation? Well, that's what Walsh gives us as crabbed and crotchety, libidinous and bibulous, obdurate and obstinate. It's a very, very good attempt to represent the same kind of internal rhyme, alliteration, rhythm, all of that. The Golden Ass is like that throughout. Satyricon, for its part, preserves many words, turns of phrase, and uses of language that we don't find anywhere else in Latin literature, and so gives us a precious glimpse of the speech patterns of non-educated characters, slaves and freedmen in particular, including their grammatical mistakes, their mispronunciations, their misuses of the Latin language. Now, like so many other texts from Greco-Roman antiquity, Petronius and Apuleius were rediscovered in the Renaissance, and Apuleius in particular quickly became very popular indeed. Boccaccio, the author of the Decameron, which you'll study in Part 3 with Professor Noble, was a great admirer of Apuleius. Boccaccio found and copied a manuscript of the Golden Ass in 1355. Before the invention of the printing press, of course, that's what you had to do. If you wanted a copy of a book you liked, you copied it out, or you hired someone to copy it out by hand for you. And Boccaccio incorporated stories from Apuleius into the Decameron. Apuleius was one of the first classical books to be printed. a collection of his, an appearance of his collected works in Rome in 1469 puts him at the very beginning of printed works in Europe. And this collected edition, printed in Latin, of course, was followed by a large number of translations throughout Europe. Perhaps most significantly, the Golden Ass became very popular in Spain. And I want to just leave you with the thought that perhaps Don Quixote, whom you'll meet in part 4 of the course with Professor Hertzman, reflects Lucius in his adventures, in his mishaps, in all of those characteristic episodes of Don Quixote. Think about the possibility that there might be a direct line of descent between Apuleius' Lucius and Cervantes' great picaresque hero, Don Quixote. In the next lecture, we'll continue talking about prose, but we'll turn to a genre that is as utterly different from the ancient novel as it could be, the Gospels of the New Testament.